Hello everybody. I propose that we start this last session. My name is Christophe Lazaro. I will be the chair of this panel. Thank you for being here and attending one of the last panel of the day. So the last, but hopefully not the least. Given the diversity of the speakers and their expertise and the originality of the topic, because it's a strange topic today that we will tackle. It's touch me, feel me, ethics in a distant world. Indeed, we will today address the issue of touch in a supposedly disembodied digital era. Let me immediately note the paradox of the term, or I would say the irony of the term digital itself, because as you surely know, it comes from the Latin digit, and digits which refer to finger, which is by excellence the organ of touch. So of course, as we will see, the notion of touch has different meanings, both literal and metaphoric. And in this panel, the speaker will try to address the complexity of this ambivalent, polysemic notion in the digital era, and explore questions such as, how do we keep in touch and relate to others through the use of digital technologies? Can these technologies help us to reconquer the sensation of non-mediated and corporeal relationship? How are we emotionally touched through and by technology? Can we care of the others at distance without touching them? Or can we destroy or kill them at distance without touching the ground of the theater of operations? And do technologies eventually render us untouchable? So let me first introduce the speakers and first the moderator. So on my, wait a minute, here. On my left here there is Pernille Tranberg. Pernille is an independent speaker and advisor in data ethics for companies, authorities and organizations. She also speaks to individuals on the data society and how to perform digital self-defense. She's the co-founder of the European think tank dataethics.eu and is often expert source in the press. She has written several books, among which the last entitled Data Ethics, The New Competitive Advantage. Then the first speaker will be Claire Lobet-Maris. Claire Lobet is a professor at the University of Namur in Belgium. She's a professor in sociology, currently working in the computer science faculty of the University of Namur, and she is also a research director at the Center of Research, Law, Information and Society, namely the CRIDS. She practiced the ethical and sociological design of technology through her involvement in many H2020 projects, and she will talk about that today. Then after Claire, we will have as a speaker, Dr. Karl Ceulemans. Dr. Karl Ceulemans is a professor and head of the Department of Behavioral Sciences at the Royal Military Academy in Brussels. His main domain of research is military ethics. He is currently co-editor of a third edition of Moral Constraint on War, Principle and Cases. He also has published in national and international journals about military ethics. After Karl, there will be Alain Loute. Alain is a philosopher. He has a PhD in philosophy, and he's a senior lecturer at the Center of Medical Ethics of the Catholic University of Lille, where he's also one of the persons in charge of the brand new Chair of Law, Ethics and Digital Health. He's also a lecturer in the Computer Science Department of the University of Namur in Belgium. After, we will also hear another expert in e-health, Petra Wilson. Petra has a PhD in public health law from the University of Oxford. Petra's experience in healthcare spans more than 20 years and covers academia, civil service, corporate and NGO sectors. In 2016, Petra established Connected Health Partner, a consultancy practice focusing on legal, regulatory and policy issues in e-health. She's also currently serving as the European Program Director for the Personal Connected Health Alliance. And finally, the last speaker will be Leonardo Cervera Navas. Leonardo Cervera is the Director of the Office of the European Data Protection Supervisor, the EDPS, the Data Protection Authority of the EU that you all know. He was appointed director in 2018, and as head of the Secretariat, he is a member of the management board of the EDPS, responsible for advising on data protection law and policy, and is in charge of the coordination and implementation of the strategies and policies of the institution. So I give the floor now to the first speaker, to Claire.
Okay, I just want to say that as a moderator, I'm not saying anything because we have very little time, but I will keep a strict look at the watch, and after 8 minutes, I'll touch you, and then you have maximum 2 minutes left. And in the name of touch, I'll really touch you.
Okay.
So, if you will start, Claire.
Yes. Thanks a lot, Mr. President and Mrs. Moderator. So I'm very happy to be here in this panel today because we will talk together about the touching vision, but also about the body, you know, and those two dimensions are quite absent and neglected when we speak about technology, except when we speak about biometry, tactile and haptic technologies. So I will start my presentation by explaining a bit, by situating a bit my speech in my ethical journey. Since 30 years in my ethical assessment practice, I have observed what I could call a sort of long journey of human distancing from the immediate and embodied context through different research and development projects. For instance, in e-health with different projects of telemonitoring, in borders management with projects of intelligent and virtual borders, in disabilities with projects with on smart white cane for visually impaired people, in e-learning with projects with of biometric authentication to sustain distant assessment of e-students. So I observe that, and I read a lot also about this distancing, human distancing. And for a philosopher, called Yanis Kallinikos, this digital journey has led to a sort of big transition from an immediate system of signification still tied to sensation and to object, to an abstract and disembodied language of representation. Kallinikos observed also that in the digital world, the direct confrontation with humans, with facts and situation, become more and more irrelevant. So for Kallinikos, this journey I observe means the ever increasing domination of what he calls an epistemology of representation in our social interaction, which means also that the human interaction are modified and affected by the disappearance of some specific sensorial universe. With a very simple expression, Zsuzsanna Zuboff qualified this transition as a general textualization of the life, general textualization of the world. That means also a world where human interaction are more and more read, observed, seen, then touched and felt. So, for Kallinikos and Zuboff, the digital journey means an increasing progression of the sense of sight, of the vision, and a progressive disappearance of the touching vision, of the touching perception in our social interactions. And my question is, what does that mean for the social interaction, for our human interaction, for the caring of each other to life in this epistemology of representation? And here comes the text on which this panel is organized, the text of Maria Puig De La Bellacasa. And she said that the touching vision, the touching perception, has some ethical specificities which are really critical for the human interaction. And I will just comment very quickly those ethical specificities and then come back to you with some proposal for the ethical assessment of technology. The first ethical specificity of the touching vision is the reversibility of touching perception. This reversibility has been suggested by Maurice Merleau-Ponty. He said, when we touch, we are also touched. That means that we are also more conscious about the effect we can have on the others because of this reversibility. The second ethical specificity of the touching vision is the vitality. We can survive without seeing, but we cannot survive without touching. That means that touching is a vital form of experience that relates us to people, that relates people to their mortality, to their vulnerability, and to the need we have to care about each other. The third specificity, the third ethical specificity is the situated topicality. That means that the touching perception, the touching vision is related to the body and to the radical empirism, the very presence of the context and of the others that give access to the specificity of the relational experience. By comparisons, Georges Simmel said that this is not the case for the site, and he said that the site make us act from a distant nowhere. We call that the clean of the site. The last ethical specificity of the touching vision is the corporality. We touch with our body, and we are touched in our body. And Philippe Corcouf, a French philosopher, observed that the touching presence of the others is an ethical condition for human interaction, since for Levinas, Emmanuel Levinas, the distress of the face of the others is immediately an ethical question, passing first by the bodies, by a touching vision, and not by a distant looking and an intellectual reading of the situation. So, what to do with all those ethical specificity in our daily job of ethical assessment of new technology, of technology to become? In my ethical job, I usually start ethical assessment of technology to become with this sentence of Madeleine Ackrich. She said that designers imagine users and context of use while at the same time delegating responsibility to the artifact. Thus, she said, and that's very important, creating new geographies of responsibility. She wrote that in 1992. And the ethical assessment, I practice consists to explore this new geography of responsibility to become between human and technology. Yeah. Okay, that means 2 minutes? Yeah, okay, fine. And the requirements they should have to endorse them. So one of my first proposals should be to explore those technologies to become not only through the geography of the responsibilities that organize the divide between human and technology, but also through a sensorial geography that organizes the divide between the various sensorial universe embarked in the design of the technology to become. This assessment could give a first approach of the ethical thickness of the human interaction that will be embodied in the design of the future technology. In Marxist terms, it could give an assessment of the human completeness fostered by technology to become. My second proposal could be to use the ethical specificity of the touching vision, touching perception, in order to assess the technology to become. One of our practice, one thing we practice in ethical assessment is to question the design of those technology with a theory of formalized criteria stemming from the ethical tradition, like those proposed by Wright or by Beauchamp and Childress. This practice is often very difficult since those principles remain purely intellectual, distant and disembodied. Questioning technology to become with the ethical specificity of a touching perception could help to translate those ethical principles in practical praxis of concern for the others. My last proposal is more general, is more general and more political. In the manuscript of 1844, Karl Marx suggests that the supreme ambition is to take the man out of the capitalist iron cage and to rehabilitate each of his human relationship with the world, seeing, hearing, feeling, tasting, touching, singing, contemplating, to want, to act, to love, in short, all acts of his human individuality. The consideration presented here raises at the end the Bourdieusian question of the digital habitus we are developing and what it means to deprive a society and our social interaction of this touching vision of the others. If we consider touching vision as an important ethical actor, then the research and development policy should explore the necessity to develop what I call a sensorial ecology in order to protect what makes the life humans. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah. Move the body a little in between. So, Carl, you're up next.
Thank you. So I have also been given 10 minutes to say something about action at a distance, but the action that I'm going to talk about is killing by remote control. So what I'm going to do in 10 minutes, it's a very complicated subject and I have very little time, so that's a bit of a contradiction, but I'll do my best. First of all, when we are talking about drone warfare, perhaps I should say a little word about what a drone is. A drone is in fact as you can see, a unmanned aerial vehicle, and to say it in a more gender-neutral term, an uninhabited, I should say, aerial vehicle that is used in some very diverse applications in our everyday life. And here on the slide you see some of the examples. So they are used, for instance, for regulating traffic, or to have some idea of a traffic jam, or to assist in rescue missions, or even in the business world to deliver packages. Of course, in the military, their use is perhaps a little less innocent. They're used, for instance, for gathering intelligence. They're used, for instance, for reconnaissance. But in the popular imagination, and thanks to a number of Hollywood blockbusters like these, for instance, you get Good Kill, you get Eye in the Sky, where you have indeed drone operators who are faced with numerous dilemmas that they face when they are going to kill people at a distance of some 1,000 kilometers. Now, what I'm going to do is to offer you some arguments that will allow you to assess whether killing at a distance is morally acceptable, yes or no. So, first of all, the use of drones as such is, yes, perhaps a little word, these are the most commonly used models or types of drones used by the US in their struggle against terror, the Predator and the Reaper. Now, a use of a drone as such is not moral or amoral. What is a problem? A moral problem with the use of drones is that they facilitate some kinds of killings, targeted killings and remote killings. As this panel is about remote killing, I will only limit myself to the remoteness of the killing. And what makes remote killing a problem is that it creates, or tends to create, not necessarily, but it tends to create a radical asymmetry. And the problems with remote killing are related with this radical asymmetry between the belligerent parties. For instance, some say that killing at a distance is unfair killing. You are killing someone who is an impossibility to kill you. You can kill him, but not vice versa. So that's unfair. You are killing people who are defenseless in sense. A second argument is that it tends to lower the threshold to use force, because when you use a drone, you radically diminishes the risk for your own troops. That could enhance or lessen, should I say, the reluctance to use force. Another argument that is generally used against remote killing is that it might provoke terrorist attacks by your opponent. Because he cannot touch your combatants, he has a tendency to touch you where it hurts, and that is in general through your civilian population, so terrorist attacks. And then there is also the last argument, that's about the loss of the typical warrior ethos. A drone operator is no longer a warrior that has to be courageous, for instance, who has to have sufficient integrity and so on. So the modern warrior has become a bureaucrat, a cubicle warrior, so to speak. So these are 4 arguments that can be used. My question now, and that is in fact what I want to do to conclude my 10-minute presentation, is do these arguments stand up to scrutiny? Are they valid arguments? Are they good arguments? Well, let's see one by one. Let's see at the fairness, or the unfairness, I should say, about drone warfare, about remote killing. Well, to be honest, war isn't a game. War isn't about giving your opponent sporting chances to win. War is about winning in the first place. So what you want to do when you're aggressed by another state is not so much reassure that your opponent has equal chance of winning the war. No, you want to maximize your own chances. So it's not about a game, it's not a sporting game. So that argument is not very convincing in my view. Then the threshold argument and the terrorist argument are arguments that are based, in fact, on empirical observation. Because we are saying when we take away the combatant from the battlefield, well, you will enhance or diminish the reluctance to use force. But is there sufficient empirical evidence to prove that? The same thing for terrorist argument. Can we be sure that the others, our opponent, will react in the terrorist way we are suggesting here? That is not certain. There is also another problem with the terrorist argument. Can we be responsible for the way they react to our actions? So that's a bit strange that we are responsible for their behavior. And then there is the last argument, the moral psychological argument, where we say that we regret, in fact, the disappearance of a warrior ethos. Well, that is not completely true. Perhaps a drone warrior or a drone operator doesn't need physical courage on the battlefield, but what he does need, for instance, is moral courage. We expect that a drone operator has the courage to say no when he is asked to perform or execute a mission that is clearly and blatantly immoral. So he should refuse to do so. So that takes some kind of courage, not physical courage, but some kind of moral courage. So let me conclude my very short presentation by a conclusion. Excuse me. So here's the conclusion. So it appears that the morality or the immorality, should I say, of remorse of remote killing is not self-evident. The arguments I used do not really are convincing, do not stand up to a close scrutiny. Does that mean that drone warfare is in the clear from a moral point of view? Certainly not. There are other aspects. I just highlighted one aspect, the remoteness of the killing. There's also another aspect that I didn't talk about, the targeted killing. So, but that is, of course, for another debate, another conference, and that concludes my presentation. I thank you very much.
Wow, I didn't get a chance to touch you. You were faster than 8 minutes.
I could have slowed down.
It was very, very interesting. These were the first two speaks, which were really, really interesting. And now we have two speakers talking on e-health, which is also kind of remote human interaction. And Alain, Loute, you're the first one. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. I would like to talk today about telemedicine and spatiality. It's the subject of my topic. But why speaking about that topic? Telemedicine is, in a way, medicine by distance. Telemedicine or telecare is caring by distance. And my question is, does telemedicine as a medicine by distance means that there is no more something about places? Is medicine by distance without places? And in the literature, for instance, in Nelly Outzorn reflection, she has noticed that a lot of discussion about ICT technology and discourse on telecare, a lot of those discourse tend to ignore places. Like if in telemedicine you erase any distance and then places, spatiality is not something important to take into account. My point of view is that spatiality matters, and it will be the first point of my speech. The second point of my speech will be to illustrate that and to show that telemedicine shape places and spatiality at different levels, at the micro level, at the meso level, and at the macro level. And I will finish my speech in raising some ethical issue linked with the spatiality and telemedicine. So, first point, I would like to draw some lessons from the philosophy of technology. We used to think about technology just as simple tools, just like instruments, just like object in front of us, subject. But for a lot of philosophers of technology, it's not correct. Technologies are, we have more to think about them in terms of media, of environment. Let's take the example of Dominique Boulier, who has been working on connected objects, and he has developed the concept of habitel, which try to speak about the ecosystem which is formed by a connected object that surround and accompany each individual. So first lesson from philosophy of technology, technology are more medium, ecosystem, like than a simple object. But we could draw another lesson from contemporary geography, because the classical view of spaces, of places, like for instance, like in Aristotle, is tend to consider places like vessel. Places are like non-portable vessels. But that means that what inside the vessel has no influence on the vessels. But for contemporary geography is not correct. And what the place contains help to configure it. So it becomes impossible to separate the places, location, from what takes place there. And we could also draw another lesson from the philosophy of medicine, from Foucault, for instance, who speak about spatialization. It's a very important concept for understanding medical act for them. So spatiality matter. My second point is to show how telemedicine modify, shape spatiality of caring, and at different level, at the macro level, at the meso level, and at the macro level. Let's begin by the macro level. We have to consider that telemedicine transform living space of patients. If you read the literature, it's a very recurrent topic. For instance, let's take the example of the telemonitoring of chronic patients. A lot of literature show that the device, the telecare device, could have the effect of transforming the home into a kind of hybrid place, hybrid between domestic place and a very medicalized place. Let's take another example from Nelly Outsoorn. She has studied the way those technology devices function, and the script of certain technologies could be very heavy for patients. Let's take the example of the telemonitoring of patients with failure, heart failure. The script, regarding the script, if certain thresholds are exceeded, for instance, let's say the weight, then a light signal is sent by a set-top box in the patient home. And then the patients have the opportunity to read a message and the possibility of viewing results on his television. But if he doesn't see the light signal, the nurse could call him to see if everything is okay. But it could be very stressful for the patients. And so a lot of patients, following according to Nelly Outsoorn, will put the set-top box just in the middle of the room to be sure that they will not miss the light signal. So that could have a real deep impact into the shaping of the home. Let's take then another example to illustrate the way telemedicine shapes spatiality, but now at the meso level. And we could here refer to the work of Madeleine Acriche, that Claire has also been referring to, and her concept of geography of responsibility. Many authors consider that digital technology have the effect of disintermediating the medical relationships. Like if I could directly catch the medical advice, but if we study more in detail the way those technology function, we realize that they have the inverse effect of remediating otherwise the medical relationship. Sometimes a third party could be implied in the medical relationships. New professional could take part of the care. Let's just take the example of new profession like technological third parties or technological service providers who could be. So telemedicine create new networks of actors, modify the organization of care. Nicolas Dodier, a French sociologist, have developed the concept of arena of technical skill. Arena is the sense of a forum, a place where you exerce your skills and you could be seen by someone else. But telemedicine create new area of technical skills. Some gesture that were before exercised in the intimate context of a cabinet now could be seen by video conference. So that create new dynamic. And finally, the telemedicine will also shape spatiality of caring at the macro level, because we have to consider that now telemedicine is something that is part of public health policies. Now telemedicine has become a tool for public health policies, for targeting some aim at the territorial level. So I will just finish saying that all that transformation raised by telemedicine raised new challenges and issues for ethics. And I think that we really have to take into account the specificity and the plurality of ethical issues related to each type of spatiality. And also to think about the articulation and the possible conflict between those levels. And in 30 seconds, I will just want to illustrate for the three levels the ethical issue. First, let's just me referring to an article from the American Journal of Bioethics, what autonomy for telecare, an externalist approach. And the authors say that autonomy is not just about giving a voice, saying what you said. in the context of telemedicine and telecare, we have to develop an externalist reading of autonomy. And autonomy would also require a certain level of control over the agent's contextual conditions that contribute to self-determination. So, okay. And at the meso level, the ethical issues that are raised are linked with that new geography of responsibility. Which are we facing a new kind of dirty work? I use that word from the sociology of health, a kind of digital dirty work. That means that behind the telecare and telemedicine, there is some care work done by real human. And is that work recognized? Is the burden of the functioning of telecare and telemedicine devices well distributed between the actors? And I finish with the micro-level ethical issues that are raised by telemedicine. The fact is that we are really facing spatial distributive justice questions and issues. Telemedicine has very often been considered as something that could respond to the question of medical deserts, places where you cannot find easily physicians. So if telemedicine could reduce inequality in access to care, is it a real response and an equitable response, or is it more a palliative response? Yeah.
Thank you very much. And now we have Petra Wilson. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to take us to another level, looking, I think, at one of the micro levels that Alain was just talking about, which is the role of consent in the e-health age. The first thing to say is the concept of consent in healthcare is certainly not new. Hippocrates sort of talked about it, but in the sort of Hippocrates paternalistic way of, I might just about engage you in making some decisions about your own healthcare, but really I as doctor know best. The image in the middle, the Nuremberg trials, where we really grappled for the first time with concepts, hard concepts of consent in research. And then the World Medical Association Declaration of Helsinki, which is in many ways the baseline of many modern legal treaties on consent. Currently, we have lots of concepts of consent, and here at this conference, where we're all very familiar with the GDPR, you will of course know that consent is one of the primary tools used for allowing the collection and sharing of data. And this is extremely important in healthcare, but I do want to recognize first that within healthcare, it's not just about consent to collection and sharing of data. There is also a concept of a simple consent to touch. Even in a medical setting, most touching of a patient without their consent is not allowed. However, as opposed to in data protection, we have a very strong concept of an implicit concept of consent. If you go to a doctor and a doctor says, I'd like to take your blood pressure and you do this, that is an adequate implicit consent to the touch that will happen. However, it may not be an adequate consent for what can be done with the data collected when the sphygmomanometer has collected that blood pressure value, and we do need to think about that. We also, going further into the concepts around data sharing in healthcare, through the GDPR, we now have new concepts around the patient having a greater control of what is done with data, how data may be reused, and perhaps even the concept of the right to be forgotten within the healthcare setting, although that is very difficult. And it's very difficult for a simple reason, and it comes back to some of the concepts about spatiality. When a doctor collects data, or a nurse, in the context of a medical setting, the information collected pertains not only to that patient, but also to the doctor or the nurse, because it is about the interaction between them. So we have new concepts of spatiality, new concepts of what consent are. Is the law that we have at the moment actually adequate? Well, the first thing I would say, regardless of whether the law is adequate, the practice of consent isn't. Now, most people in this room probably aren't English speaking. as a mother tongue. But you may know this expression. In a hospital, a senior doctor will very often say to a junior doctor, go and get the patient consented. Consenting is something that is done to a patient. It doesn't actively involve a patient. And this is where a lot of our problem lies, because the law may say that consent is something that has to be informed and has to be nurtured. In practice, it tends still to be rather top-down. So the question that I want to pose, is the current concept of consent that we have in healthcare actually any good for the digital age, for e-health? In an age and when the law says that consent must be informed, do we actually give people enough information? Do we give them the time to digest information? In how far can consent be in any way tailored to the individual? How do we balance this need for the individual and yet the requirement for legal certainty about what consent is? How do we deal with issues which are still very prevalent in the law, that consent is a one-off static event, whereas what we do is very dynamic and changes, and particularly in the healthcare world, and particularly in the era of chronic diseases. When you're first diagnosed with diabetes, you're a new person in that land. When you've lived with diabetes for 20 years, you know it better than the physician treating you. So your consent becomes a very different animal at that stage. And I think also we need to think about the disintermediation concept raised by Alain. Nowadays, when we have more and more ways of engaging in healthcare where there isn't a direct relationship, where the doctor can't look you in the eye and understand whether you have understood the information that has been given and whether therefore your consent is valid, is the notion that we have still in any way useful? My argument would be it isn't, and here are just some pictures of things that I'm sure have popped up on your screens many times. And I wonder how many people in this room have actually read consent forms. I did a little survey a while ago for the European Commission on what a good consent form might look like in healthcare, in particularly in remote healthcare. And the longest consent form I came across was 58 pages. How can anyone, and particularly somebody seeking medical care, take in 58 pages of information? But we also need to think about when we ask for consent. We tend to ask for consent immediately before something happens, because that's what the Nuremberg trials taught us. It's also what the Helsinki Code demands. But is that right anymore? The impact of a treatment or taking part in research will be long-term. Is it right to ask for consent there and then? Or should we make sure that we have methods for sustaining and fostering understanding and to actually supporting the decision-making of the individual? Is the scope of consent relevant to the sorts of things we consent to here? And I've got various images there. I want to take, conscious of my time, a little moment to talk about them. Claire talked a lot about the importance of touch. That plush animal, the seal, is now a very well-known toy-ish. It is actually a robot that is used in the care and treatment of patients with dementia. And actually, the Belgian government has just decided this is going to be implemented quite widely here in Belgium because it has very significant impact. But what do we know about the ethics of consent? You're giving this to somebody with dementia. You're collecting a lot of information about them. What's happening to that information? How much are they able to understand what this toy that seems to respond to them personally, how much are they able to understand, and is our law adapted to that? We have on the top left-hand corner the automatic pill box. It's an excellent tool for supporting older people who may have, or younger people with busy lives, or anybody who may have difficulty in remembering whether they've taken the medication they should do. That's great, but where does that data go? Who can do something with it? What is the value of it? The Fitbit, or some other brand, it doesn't have to be Fitbit, collects lots of ambient information. That has huge value in the healthcare sector, but actually it's very, very poorly used in the healthcare sector because we're still hung up on ideas that for a doctor to be able to use information, the doctor needs to have, or a nurse needs to have asked for consent, you need to have given it specifically, and it needs to work in that refined setting. And then the double helix in the middle, the ultimate information, DNA information, are we ready and is our law ready to really tackle the potential, the huge potential, but also the huge risk of widespread use of DNA data. So my argument would be we have an excellent basis in the law, but I think we need to move on. And one of the ways in which we could move on is around the area of so-called dynamic consent. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this, but what I do want to do is, you don't need to read all the text here, is I'm going to show you a picture of some examples of new models of consent that are being used. These are new models of consent particularly targeted at the research arena, where it's been recognized that a static one-off consent to research based on information given there and then is not the right way to go forward. And you have, for example, the Curata, which is a particular consent tool for people with chronic diseases. As I said before, when you have a chronic disease, you soon become an expert in your condition, much more so than the person treating you. We have 23andWe, which is a public good version of 23andMe, which is an internet-based search tool and engine based around DNA data that people willingly share into the research community. We also have Rudy, which is a particular tool developed for rare diseases, even more than chronic diseases. You have a community who tend to know much more about their disease than anybody treating them. The Encore model was actually funded by the European Commission. It's a model being run out of several hospitals in Oxford. And the TAP model is the idea that consent is something that you should be able to turn on and off as and when you want to. And it's particularly based on the idea that as a patient, sometimes we're very vulnerable and we don't want to make decisions, and we want people to help us, and at other times we're feeling strong and we want to be able to have much more control over that tap. So I just give you these as some examples to stop us getting into this situation, because I think we are in danger of getting to a point where doctors become so worried about the law of consent that they might even put a patient's life at risk and say, stop, we don't have consent. It's time to develop new models of consent, new understanding that is actually fit for what we can do with electronic health now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And our final speaker is Leonardo Cervera Navas from EDPS, the EU representative here. Thanks.
I don't have a PowerPoint. Thank you very much. Thank you to Namur University for inviting me, and thank you all for being in the audience. It's more than 6 in the evening, so thank you for being with us. I feel a little bit handicapped here because I'm just a bureaucrat, a lawyer, and I accepted the invitation to be here mostly to hear new things that normally you don't hear in your working office. And I've learned a lot, and I'm very grateful for that. The only thing I would like to do with you today, and I'm talking under the supervision of my colleagues who are there in the room, and they are working on ethics at the EDPS, is to brief you very briefly about the main insights, the main takeaways of the report published by the Ethics Advisory Group convened by the EDPS last year. So maybe you can go away with 3 or 4 findings from this report, and hopefully that will help you. But first, I would like to start with an anecdote, which I think illustrates very well the kind of changes we are living. So many years ago, I took my kid to Virgin Beach in my home city in Malaga. So there is a touristic destination, so beaches are really bad. But if you go far, far away, sometimes you can find some beaches that are well protected and So I took him there, he took his scuba dive, and then he went below the water, and then he saw real fish moving around. And so he went out and he said, wow, this is like a video game. And then I realized that for him, reality and whatever digital reality was kind of mixed in his head, and the digital reality was associated with beauty and virtue and things. I was totally amazed by that. That was 15 years ago, and since then I've seen that we have gone in this direction, where we are starting to mix in our heads digital and real life, and digital values and real values, and we are at the moment in a very confusing state. And what this report tries to do precisely is to help us to navigate in this shift from personhood in the old sense and personhood in the digital sense. We started this already in 2015 when the EDPS published an opinion called Toward a New Digital Ethics. And since then, we have been working with this ethics advisory group, convening workshops, meetings, and recently in the international conference, I guess some of you attended, that we organized in the European Parliament in October, where the whole thing was about digital ethics. So what do you get from this report? This report tells you that we are moving into new territory in terms of values and even in terms of vocabulary. So we don't talk about privacy, now we talk about digital privacy. We don't talk about friendship, now we talk about Facebook friendship. We don't talk about intelligence, now we talk about artificial intelligence, reality, virtual reality. So it means that this digital age we are entering has new things. And these are the kind of things that we need to explore and we need to understand. It's our human experience, like my boy when he dived in the sea, is changing. And we are behaving and socializing in a different way. So, for example, this report will tell you all these changes, how do they affect basic principles that we have had in our society for a long time, such as dignity, freedom, or autonomy, or justice, or trust. So, an important concept that this report will teach us is that human being is something bigger than his or her personal data. Because if we don't make this distinction, we can quickly go to a scenario where part of our identity can be put on sold, can be sold, can be purchased. And that's something that is totally against any principles or any ethics. So imagine, for example, well, not imagine, see what is going on nowadays. So we can be very polite, be very educated when we are behaving in a social, real way. But then, when people go to the internet, they become suddenly very rude. They insult each other, and they do things that will be totally unthinkable from the real world. And things that we would normally be considered very discriminatory are becoming a kind of rule if they are done with the help of algorithm. So this is because there is this dissociation between our personhood, the person we are, and our digital emanation, our personal data, that then can be mistreated completely, and then all these problems start to appear. So think, for example, on not such a distant future where we will all live with augmented reality glasses, or where we will have hearing aid here, where we will immediately translate everything that we hear in a foreign language. So when we are in this scenario that is not so distant in the future, our perception of reality will totally change. And in this world that we are slowly getting into, the values and the experience is changed completely. And we are therefore confronted with paradoxes that are discussed in this interesting report. Think, for example, of a crowd of 50 people following you all day long in the street, even getting into your houses and looking at everything that you do and taking recordings of everything that you say. You would say, that's not possible, that's unthinkable, but this is exactly what is happening with our smart devices and our telephones and navigation on the internet, that we are constantly under surveillance. And for some reason, we accept that, but we don't accept when it happens in the real life. So these kind of paradoxes are somehow tackled in this report by explaining of this dissociation that some interested players are doing between real personhood and digital personhood. And there is explained very clearly. And then you have the paradox also that now we have internet that is supposed to, 2 minutes, I got it. So we have now internet, which is supposed to be the mother of all freedoms, to the point that even the United Nations have said that access to internet should be considered like a human right. But at the same time, this internet environment has the capacity to diminish all our traditional rights, or can even allow third countries to hack our democracies. And we are in a conference that's precisely talking about democracy. So the main takeaway from this report is that the respect of human dignity and its inviolability should be put at the core of our digital lives. And personhood and personal data should be inseparable from one another, and therefore allowing this dissociation between both opens up opportunities to seriously affect the human rights and the foundations of democratic governance, or creating new forms of discrimination. Talking under the supervision of Katerina, who has been working on this topic for a long time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, anyone with questions, please get up to the microphone. I hope you have questions, otherwise I will have them, but I will let you get your questions first. We have 9 minutes. No questions? Yes. No questions? Okay, I'll pose the first question then. Because now we've learned we cannot survive as humans without touch. And where are the limits? I think we are all taking for granted that this is just going on. We're going to accept total surveillance. We're going to do more and more telemedicine. We're going to have remote wars. Are there any ways in these areas where we can actually say, this is how far we'll go, this is where we'll stop? Are there anything in, for example, telemedicine, where we should say, no, we won't do this? This is a limit, so we'll kind of... it's all about keeping humanity, right? So have you thought about that, the limits? Why do we say no to this? What do we say no to? Maybe you will start with a war, because that should be obvious, shouldn't it?
When cannot you kill?
What kind of remote killing should we say no to?
Well, in fact, when people go to war, they always try to put as much distance between them and their enemy as possible. So that's nothing new. It has always existed. So when you get a slingshot, or you get a rock that you can throw farther than your opponent, so that's a good thing. You can touch him, but he can touch you. So you got an arrow and a bow and an arrow, he hasn't, so that's a good thing. You can kill him, he can't kill you. Of course, so my perception of the drone warfare is that it is not so much a new phenomenon in nature, but it's more in degree. And I think that we have not seen the last of it, because now, as you probably know, we are more and more pushing not only to remote killing, but to autonomous killing, which is even worse, because then you got machines who take off by themselves when they feel like it. I'm exaggerating, of course. But machine learning, right? And so they're going to hunt you, or they're going to hunt human prey, and they're going to identify and they go in to eliminate. So then we are in another Hollywood blockbuster that I talked to you about, not about, like Terminator or something like that. And that, I think, is the biggest fear of a lot of people. It's not so much drone warfare, remote killing. Of course, there are problems with that, but I think for the moment, the most people are, the thing that people fear most for the moment is the evolution that drone warfare is some kind of a stepping stone to autonomous killing, and that is the fear, I think. So, unfortunately, history has proven that humans are very, I say, imaginative when it comes to waging war, and I think we haven't seen, unfortunately, the end of it.
Oh my God. Claire and then Petra.
I don't want to sound pessimistic, but
Well, you do, sorry.
yes, I'm afraid so.
I think it's difficult to answer to your question like this. Is there a point that we cannot go across? It's not like this, but I think what we talk about, what we presented this afternoon, showed the real critical importance to have ethical deliberation on each project, on each technology to become. And sometimes, in my experience, I do a lot of project, research and development project for the Commission of the Commission. In my experience, sometimes, you know, the law, and I like very much what you told us, Petra, but the law is the only, you know, the only thing very critical for the engineers. They have to, they are really, really very cautious to be very compliant with the data protection, with the privacy protection and so on. And sometimes ethics, you know, an ethical debate, ethical questioning of those technology to become are something, you know, so soft, so flexible, so and so on and so on. But I think when we come to the development, for instance, of technology that will have major impacts on our life, like what you explained, but also in medical, but also in education. We have to deliberate those technologies with some ethical principles, and we have to we have to have procedures, real procedure to organize this ethical deliberation about those technologies to become.
Thanks.
Thank you. Your question was, is there a frontier that we can't cross? And I would say there isn't, and there are never uncrossable frontiers. What I think, though, we have now is we are in a kind of frontierless land. We have new maps that are emerging all the time, but we're using an old GPS. Yeah. And for me, the law is the GPS. We're using old laws that to navigate around new possibilities, and they're not fully adapted. And just, don't want to go into big detail, but I want to leave you with a thought, which is that you also asked about remote killing and what that could mean for this. We live in a country here in Belgium which is relatively unusual in having quite liberal laws on euthanasia. Yet the idea of euthanasia being completely disintermediated, of a doctor being able to kill or help a patient to end their own life remotely, is ethically very worrying to many people. And yet we have every possibility to do that. And I think this is one of the examples of what I mean is we have new frontiers, we have a new geography, but we don't have a GPS suitable for it. Yeah. And as a lawyer, I would always say law has to be part of building that new GPS, but actually it's probably time for law to be more inclusive and to bring more people into the discussion and not be so top down, but actually help build that new GPS bottom up.
Oh, that's a very, very good way of ending. Unless any of you have some more comments? The last comment, yeah.
I would give one GPS, which is Article 1 of the European Charter of European Fundamental Rights, which says human dignity is inviolable, must be respected and protected at all times. Yeah. I think this is beyond the law. It is touching, well, it's in the law because it's a fundamental right, but I think we have to stick to this principle of dignity of the individual. And it's a powerful, I think, GPS, because at least for us Europeans, I was talking in the US last week and I was mentioning these concepts and they were a little bit, yeah, these Europeans. But here in Europe, I think it's a powerful GPS.
Thank you.
Thank you for those wise words. I would like to thank everybody. I would like to thank the University of Namur for organizing this panel. I would like to thank the speakers for the quality of their interventions, and of course, our fantastic, touching moderator. I hope that you were as stimulated than me, and I wish you a good evening. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.